Okay, great. So I pretty much know almost everybody in the room, but nonetheless, I guess I should introduce myself. So my name is Yitzchak Blau. I teach mostly at Orayta and a little bit at Lindenbaum, and I'm very excited to be here. And the topic today is going to be about whether children suffer for their parents' sins. And it's a very, very interesting topic, I think an important topic. I want to put it in a larger context and then get to the specific context. And the larger context would be how we think about collective punishment or collective reward and punishment versus individual reward and punishment. Because I think we could all realize that that is a question beyond parents and children. Like one could ask that about a national entity also. And this comes up a lot in terms of Am Yisrael in Tanakh. Just to give a couple of examples where this plays out on a larger national entity. And clearly Tanakh is drawn in both directions. For example, we have Avram famously saying to God in stone, right? How could it be that you'll punish the righteous with the wicked? Strong sense that stone should not be subject to collective punishment. In Sefer Bamidbar, there's a place where Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Ha'ish echad yechtav al kol ha'eda yiktzof." Will one man sin, and anger will be on everybody? Again, this argument for individual judgment. However, I think if we're honest about it, as we look through Tanakh, Tanakh does not always play out that way. And just to give one famous example, I think if we go to Sefer Yoshua and we think about the Achan story, right? Why did they lose the battle in Ai? They lose the battle because a man named Achan broke the rule not to take from the spoils of Yericho, and therefore they collectively lose the battle with, I think, some 30 some odd deaths. So there it seems to be that one person, one individual's problem, transgression, has a larger impact on the collective. So I just want to point out this is a very important question in general, but it's not obvious to me that the national entity question and the parent-children question are the same question. I mean, there's a rough similarity in that there's this tension between collective judgment and individualized judgment, but I could see someone coming to a different moral conclusion in the two cases. Someone might think about collective family judgments different than collective national entity judgments without getting to even which way that would go. So I just want to start by putting that on the board that on the one end, this is part of a much larger topic. At the same time, we're going to be focused in on family rather than on national entities in general. Okay, terrific. Let us now get to the family, and we'll see here as well that there's tension. Maybe this is just true about Tanakh in general, that in complex issues, we're not going to be surprised to find sources that pull in different directions. So let's just start even with the biblical evidence. I want to say, I'm probably going to, even though I usually more interactive, I'm mostly going to lecture for the first part, but please feel free to write any comments in the chat, a observation, a question. I'm pretty good at multitasking, and I'll be able to read your comment in the intro. Okay, so let's get started. So there are two prominent places where it seems that somehow children do suffer for their parents' sins. So one is actually the Aseret HaDibrot in Shemot Perek Chaf. And if you look at the source sheet in front of you, it has Lo tishtachve lehem v'lo ta'avdem, right? Don't worship foreign gods. Don't serve them. Don't bow to them. Ki anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am your God. Kel kana, I am a jealous God, as it were. Poked avon avod al banim, and I visit the sins of the fathers on the children. Al shileshim va'al rubeim, on the third and the fourth generation. Lisonai, to those that hate me. So it seems like God does visit the sins of the parents on the children. Now, granted, it comes with a limitation. It sounds like it's not for eternity. It's for 3 or 4 generations, but it does seem to be part of the divine mode of functioning. Okay, but as I said, it's very good to not, make too many conclusions based on one source. Okay, so one more source that takes us in the same direction, and this is also from a very prominent place. This is when after Chet HaEgel, and God gives Moshe the 13 attributes of mercy. But it's interesting because as you go through the 13 attributes of mercy, at the very end, there are some attributes that seem less merciful. But let's start with attributes of mercy. Notzer chesed la'alafim. That sounds much better. How long does God guard chesed? For 2,000 generations. Okay, that's pretty good. No se avon v'fesha v'chata. He bears various kinds of sin. V'nakeh lo yinakeh. But here it is again. Wait. Pokeid avon avod al banim v'al bnei banim. Again, God visits the sins of the parents on the children. Al shilishim v'al rabbeim. Till 3 or 4 generations. Now here one can say there's a more positive spin because the chesed side of divide was much more impactful. Alafim for 2,000 generations. Nonetheless, we still have again the sense of the children being punished for the parents' sins for at least 3 or 4 generations. So we do have 2 prominent psukim seemingly indicating children get punished for their parents' sins. Again, one from the Aseret Dibrot and one from God's speech where he outlines his attributes of mercy. However, those of you who are upset, hang in there. We will now see 4 different psukim on the other side. Life is about to get more interesting and complicated, okay? And we'll see that, wait, now it's going to come a question, what exactly is the Torah's message here? Because we are now going to see a totally different orientation. Okay, here we go. So now we don't even need to get to Nach, already in Chumash. Let us go to Sefer Dvarim. What does it say in Dvarim Chaf Daled? Lo yumtu avot al banim. Parents, fathers do not die for their children's sins. Well, it doesn't say sins, but do not die due to their children. Ubanim lo yumtu avot, nor do children die for their parents. And lest you think this is not about sin, how does the pasuk end? Ish bechet o yumat, right? Yumatu, a very strong sense of individual responsibility. A person dies based on his own sins. So Dvarim Chav Daled seems to fly in the face of the 2 sources we saw in Shmo. Okay, so already the Chumash, the biblical record from Chumash, is already a bit complicated. And here, when we get to Nach, it becomes even more prominent. Okay, so if we go to Sefer Melachim, and I love when this happens, when Nach explicitly relates to Chumash. So there's a story in Nach where a king of Yehuda named Amatzia, who was actually a good king. So Amatzia is victorious. But look what Tanakh says about how he deals with his enemies. Really remarkable. So why didn't he strike the sons, right? I think it was probably pretty common in the ancient world, right? You not only wiped out the fathers, you wanted to wipe out their kids so they wouldn't come back trying to get vengeance against you. Why didn't he hit the Bnei HaMakim? He says, I quote a pasuk, "Kakatu b'sefer Torah Moshe, asher tzivashtem limar, lo yumtu avod al banim, banim yumtu al avod, ki im b'shpechato yumat." This is pretty remarkable. Here Amatzia says, well, I learned my Sefer Dvarim. I know in Sefer Dvarim, it's not considered a good thing to, harm children based on what their parents did. I don't feel comfortable doing that, so I'm not going to touch the children of my enemies. So you not only have the pasuk in Dvarim, you actually have it put into action. You see how it impacted the behavior of Am Yisrael in biblical history during the First Kingdom. Terrific. And let's go a little bit further in Jewish history. And now these are kind of things I love because there's to be a knowledgeable person, I'm always amazed. I don't know if I'll do a brief tangent if you don't mind. Okay, if you ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin, I found it really fascinating that Harriet Beecher Stowe will allude to psukim, and she won't tell you she's alluding to psukim. And I realized that at some point that what is she assuming? She's assuming that the average reader knows his or her Bible, which is interesting. I just don't think modern authors could assume that. I go, maybe in 1800s, America, you could assume that. Okay, so I just find it very interesting. So quote Yeshayahu, and you're supposed to somehow get, the flower wither, the flower fadeth, whatever the case may be. So here's a phrase people should know, right? You're an educated human being, you should know your classic biblical phrases. Okay, so what's the phrase? Or do you ever have this idea? The parents ate sour grapes and the children's teeth were set on edge. This was apparently, I just highlighted it. This was apparently a phrase about children suffering for their parents' sins. Again, parents eat the sour grapes and it's their children whose teeth are set on edge. But look what Yirmiyahu says. Bayamimim, in these days, lo yomru od avot achlu boser. People will no longer say the parents ate sour grapes. V'shine banim tikena. And this blunted, this dulled, this set on edge, the teeth of the children. And apparently they won't say it anymore because it's not true. They will stop saying this mashal. So again, Yirmiyahu is a strong voice for individual responsibility. Okay, one more, and then we'll wrap up the biblical evidence. Yechezkel also was a major champion of individual responsibility. So if you look at the sixth source, Yechezkel says, as clear as you could want, Hanefesh hachotei hi tamut. The sinning soul should die. Ben lo yisa bavon ha'av. The child will not bear the sin of the father. V'av lo yisa bavon ha'ben, nor the vice versa. Tzidka ratzark lav tiyeh, v'rishad rasha alav tiyeh. It is just about who you are. So if we stop right here, I'd like to raise two questions. Okay, maybe and then we'll pause for a second if anybody wants to make a comment. Okay, we seem to have a bit of contradictory evidence. So is there a way to get out of the contradiction? Again, what's the contradictory evidence? Both in the case of the Maseret HaDibrot and in the Yud Gimel Midot, in Sefer Shemot, God talked about punishing children for their parents' sins. Dvarim says this doesn't happen, at least regarding death. And then Malachim says that Amatzia, the king, put this into practice. And then both Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel are very much adamant about individualized responsibility. And Yirmiyahu says, stop saying that mashal about how the parents' sins affect the children. Okay, terrific. So we have a contradiction. We're going to try to deal with it. One other point, I think, which is going to be more of our issue, beyond the contradiction, we have kind of almost the moral philosophical question. I mean, what would it mean for children to suffer for their parents' sins? Or why should they? Why is it fair for children to suffer for their parents' sins? Which is not, like, irrespective of the contradiction, I think it is a reasonable question. Okay, so I think we have two very good questions. Maybe, I'm just curious if some of you are thinking that maybe things change in Jewish history. This is not something we're going to explore so much, but it is an interesting possibility. Like, notice we had Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, and we have Dvarim versus Shemot. I'm almost wondering if someone's going to say, wait, maybe somehow earlier in Jewish history, there was more collective family responsibility. That was the model in Shemot. And somehow, as Jewish history, as biblical history continues, we move to the Dvar model, and that becomes dominant as time goes along. So I just want to toss it out there. One, again, we now have two fundamental questions. Is there a contradiction that can be resolved? And what would it mean for children to suffer for their parents' sins? I have tossed out one possibility that maybe there's actually a change. Maybe we see a chronological development that we move from the family being responsible to individual responsibility. Okay, before we explore these two questions, would anyone like to make a comment, an answer, or a question? You could either actually take the mic for a second. Seema, the floor is yours.
Okay, hi, thank you. I find the source about Amatzia to be very interesting. I always looked at this concept of children suffering for parents as a divinely intervened rather than a tzivui to man.
Seema, that was great. It was so great. We're going to see it in the Rashbam in a second. Okay, very good.
Okay, thank you.
I see two more participants raise their hands. Let's just see who they are. Okay, this is great, actually. I didn't realize we're going to be a bit interactive. Okay, Aryeh or the fellow next to Aryeh, whoever's raising their hand over there.
Hi, I'm Bert Nussbacher. How are you?
Oh, how are you, Bert? Nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. When I last spoke with you, many, many years ago, your kids were playing Little League. Shows you how long ago that was.
Yeah. The youngest is now 19, so it was a long time ago.
Yeah, it was some time ago. Anyway, I've always, had trouble, when we do in the Yom Kippur davening, we say, I'm not one of those who want to judge what my parents or ancestors did, and so I skip that. I just simply don't say it because I don't believe that that's the case. I can't, they're not responsible for me. I'm not responsible for them. What could I have done to change their behavior? What could they do to change my behavior? They're dead.
Yeah, look, it's a fair point. It's actually quite interesting. I just think it raises another angle that maybe I'll leave aside for now. Because beyond the question of collective judgment, you're raising a question, I think, do I have a right to assert somebody else's sinfulness? Which I think might be a question just of like my assertion, my attitude, not even just a question of judgment and punishment. So it is a very good question, but I think I'm going to leave it aside for now. Who are you?
Yeah, I was gonna say that I think like in the first pasuk in Shemot, at least, I think kind of like the first part of the pasuk was talking about idolatry and bowing down to other gods. So maybe like in a situation where the sin is like more like grave, like one that like strikes more at the heart of like Jewish faith, then it becomes a situation where it could be the children are going to feel responsible. But in Dvarim, it's like a concrete example.
Okay, guys, one of the great things about giving shiur to intelligent people and good students is that they anticipate what's coming. It's great. So we're going to see that what was suggested, who suggested before? Sima. What Sima suggested is in the Rashbam, and what Arya suggested is in the Ramban. We're going to get there in a minute. All right, Alana, you're on.
Yes, I was just wondering if maybe in the Torah it's more aspirational, and by the time we hit Nevi'im, this is already like what is actually going on. So while ideally it would be nice to set up a system where this would, where the divine attribute would punish further on, in reality, it just doesn't work, and therefore it's being, mitigated and removed.
Okay, so Alana, it's a very intriguing idea. If I could just ask you to flesh it out a bit more. Like if you say the ideal is individual responsibility, and somehow...
the ideal is not. The ideal is collective responsibility.
Oh, I misunderstood you. The ideal is
the
collective.
way around. Then the Torah would like to say that the parents are bad. It is this tainted throughout the generation.
Okay, so Alana, if you could just take it a step further for me, I think, again, I don't mean to speak for other people. I think a lot of people's gut reaction would be that fairness would be more towards individual responsibility. So I'm curious why, in your mind, the ideal would actually be the collective judgment.
I guess this would be like if you're looking at the nation as being unified, then, it's one of those, when one limb hurts, we all hurt. Shouldn't it be like this? When there's a problem, when there are a few rotten apples, the whole bunch will be spoiled. But as people disperse and live, and spread out in Israel, and everybody's leading their own life, like that just doesn't work because...
Okay, so Alana, you're saying something really interesting. I think it might get to my previous distinction between family and a national entity, but I'm not sure. Meaning you're suggesting something important. I think most of us, our gut reaction is individual responsibility is the better way to go. And you're saying it's not so obvious. Maybe there's some value to a sense of collective responsibility, collective judgment. I think you're onto something. I'm just curious, maybe even the way you said it, you kind of shifted to the national question. So I kind of alluded to this before. I'm wondering if someone might be more comfortable with that on a national scale than in terms of a family, right? So Alana, would you argue just as strongly for family, or you're thinking more just on the national issue?
Well, I'm just thinking like, Matan Torah, like this is when the Jewish people, like this is when you're moving from a family of Yaakov to the nation of Israel. So kind of in the ideal state, that's back to like a Aseret Chadibrot and the collective punishment of the Heit Ha'egel. Like at that point, that's kind of the family and the nation is one and the same. So the whole time the psukim which are in the desert, like this is, it almost doesn't matter because it's the same thing. But once they end up in Israel and everybody gets their land, all of a sudden there is this division, and now you have to figure out how you want to go.
Great. Rachel, I'm going to get you 1 second. So, Alana, you make a very good point. I'm going to leave aside for now, which is I suggested perhaps a chronological development before, and you're saying maybe it has to do with a growing sense of peoplehood or a growing sense of family, which is interesting. If we trace Chumash, do we have that? Do we have a sense that, now they really become a people? Now they really become a collective entity? Like, what is the moment that occurs? Yeah, Rachel, please.
It's easier to see over here.
I think for the collective versus the individual, it's really important to know what the punishment is, because when you're talking capital punishment, I have a problem with that. When you're talking about sanctions for a nation, maybe I don't have a problem with that. Maybe Germany was held a certain way, Iran is held a certain way, and the suffering is for a good reason and a strategic point. It's very different depending on the punishment.
Okay, well, we really have an excellent group here today. So let me just pick up on Rachel's 2 points. Number one, I think her points about Germany and Iran are very important, because if we really look into it, I know we'd like to say we're modern Western liberals, we only punish individuals. It's just not true. We all do some kind of collective punishment. Otherwise, we can never sanction any nation. Presumably in Iran right now, there's some decent human beings who are struggling economically because of sanctions, right? I don't know how we could possibly avoid that. So I think that's an important point that, again, I'm not saying we should always go with collective punishment, but the idea that we could avoid it altogether might be a fallacy. I also agree with her that maybe we're more comfortable with somebody economically struggling than with putting somebody to death. And one thing that might work out nicely with Rachel's approach is in Sefer Dvarim, what was the punishment mentioned when it said we don't punish children or fathers for each other? It was death. So we now, in theory, have another possible solution. I said maybe things change over time. Maybe it depends which punishment we're talking about. Maybe death is something can only be reserved for individual responsibility. But other kinds of sanctions, we live with the fact that there could be this collective judgment. Okay, anybody else before we move on? That was very good. We did a very good job there. Okay, terrific. So let's see a couple of commentaries on this issue. Okay, so you know what? I'm going to go a little bit out of order because since Aryeh Padua mentioned the Ramban, I just want to show you something really fascinating. Now, a lot of Mefarshim are going to be bothered by the idea of collective judgment, and they're going to claim it doesn't happen. And the Ramban is going to be one of the few Rishonim, or one of the Rishonim who's not bothered by it. He says it really does happen. He's okay with a certain amount of collective judgment. But look what he says here. At the very end, okay, maybe I'll highlight for a second. At the very end, he throws in something pretty remarkable. Okay, here we go. So says the Ramban, maybe this very strict attribute of God, punishing children for parents, ba'avodat gilulim bilvad. That's only in the world of avodah zarah. So he does the Aryeh Padua move. He says, maybe I should limit it based on context. And if I limit it based on context, then I'm in good shape, right? It was discussing, the passage in the Aseret HaDibrot was discussing avodah zarah. Kiba yazir, avo b'shara mitzvot, ish bavono yamut. But in other mitzvot, that's individualized, as Yirmiyahu says. Now, before we move on, I just want to point out, someone could say, I don't like any kind of collective punishment, and they're not happy. But if you're kind of open to it, but wouldn't want it to be a major theme, so this Ramban might work out very well for you. Right, the Ramban would say only when it gets to the most grievous things like avodah zarah, right, pagan worship, there we have this unusual phenomena of families being punished. But short of that, we would not. But then to get to one other interesting and to whet your appetite for 20 minutes from now, v'hasod hanistar b'pokei davon banim b'tchilat sefer kohelet timtze'enu. But the secret of how this works, you'll find it in Kohelet. Okay, now we're going to find out who is a Kabbalist among us. Okay, I don't know which of you has Kabbalistic inclinations, but this is a very fascinating thing in Jewish history. Many of you know that the Ramban, one of the most important commentaries of all time, was a Kabbalist, but he did not believe that Kabbalah was for the masses. And that's a very interesting educational debate. Like nowadays, like anybody, you go to your local, I don't know, whatever, and Madonna's taking a Kabbalah class. It's for everybody. Okay, but that was not true in the Ramban's era. The Ramban thought this was the kind of this esoteric wisdom that was only for certain people. He did not believe in publicizing it. But then you have this kind of intriguing thing, the Ramban will allude to it. So anytime the Ramban, at the end of his commentary, says there's a secret, it is Kabbalistic. So there's some Kabbalistic approach. And notice he said it's rooted in Kohelet. V'kvar katavtiv, and I already alluded to it in Breshit Lamed Chet. So we're going to find out later today what that secret is. But again, in the Ramban, we now have two approaches. Approach one in the Ramban is, this is a trait of God, but he only does it regarding idolatry. Approach two, there's some Kabbalistic secret. Now you might say, what are we going to do now? The Ramban didn't tell us what it is. But now I'm going to reveal a good trick in life. There was a man named Rabbeinu Bechaye, not the one who wrote the Chovot HaLevavot, a later one, who was 2 generations after the Ramban. And guess what? When the Ramban alludes to Kabbalistic hints, he spells it out. So we can go to Rabbeinu Bechaye and find out what the Ramban was getting at. Okay, so we are going to do that, but in about 10 minutes. Okay, so let's go back now. And we'll see. I want to just show you, since we saw Aryeh's approach, I'd like to show Seema's approach.
Rabbi,
Okay.
can I just ask you a question about
Yeah,
Aryeh's
please.
approach?
Actually, can we just, Seema, if we could just wait one more minute?
Okay.
I'll show one more thing and then I'll stop again for comments, okay? Is that all right? Let us just see the Rashbam for 1 second, because it'll help me wrap up almost 4 approaches to the contradiction. Okay, let's see the Rashbam on 8. Ubanim loim tolavot. So Seema noticed, wait, but maybe there's a difference between divine processing and human punishments. Like, we could imagine that a human court has limitations or different ways of functioning versus divine. In theory, the distinction go in different ways. So look what he says. Who is Dvarim addressing? Now, Simi, you'll tell me in a minute if this is the way you meant it the other way. Ubanim loim tolavot bebeitin. That's when a human court functions. But God, poked avot al banim. Now, I admit, some of you could say, but wait, I think it should be the opposite. But he wants to argue, but maybe Malachim forces you into this. I think this is what Seema was raising, that no, it's the human court who doesn't punish. So somehow, we don't want humans to punish collectively. That's too dangerous. But God, I guess, has the ability to do it in the proper fashion. Like, only God could understand how proper collective punishment works. So that is what enables him to do so. So I just want to, I'll take a break in 1 second, but I think we're going to wrap up my approach to our approaches to the first question, and then we'll get to the second question. Again, question 1 was, isn't there a biblical contradiction? Notice, I think we've developed a lot of nice ideas. One idea would be something changes over the course of biblical history. I suggested that. Okay, Rachel Burke suggested that death is different than other punishments. And indeed, Dvarim Chaf Dalet is emphasizing about death. Okay, Sima suggested that, wait, maybe one is the human court, one is the divine court. I think she might have been going in the opposite direction. The Rashbam wants to claim that a human court could only punish the sinner. It's too dangerous to give them the ability to collectively punish. Maybe we don't trust humanity. But God, he has the ability to do collective punishment correctly. So that would be the Rashbam. That's 3. 4, we had the Ramban. And the Ramban might simply say, no, one was about Avodah Zarah. One was about the rest of the Torah. In Avodah Zarah specifically, due to its severity, there we have collective family punishment, but it's limited to that. Okay, so we now have 4 approaches to the contradiction. Our next question is going to be, how do we understand it philosophically per se, ethically per se? But before that, let's stop again for questions. This is a good place. Who had a hand up?
I just wanted to ask something about the, can you scroll down to the Ramban again?
Yeah, sure. Sure, my pleasure. 1 second.
So my question is,
Give me
the
1 second, I'm sorry.
Ramban, yeah. The Ramban is saying that only in the cases of Avodah Zarah. So does that mean that a child, where does tshuva fit in here? If a child is not an Oved Avodah Zarah, is he still liable for his father having been an Oved Avodah Zarah?
So we're going to see in a second that many of the medieval commentaries were extremely resistant to that idea. They did not like it at all. I just want to be as honest as possible. The Ramban seems to be okay with it. Right. And the Ramban seems to think once I've limited to Avodah Zarah, I could deal with this issue. Now, again, you could still say I object to it in any context. I object to it in Avodah Zarah. And maybe the Ramban would concede that the boy could do tshuva, or the girl could do tshuva. But the Ramban seems to say there is such a phenomena of the children of Ovdei Avodah Zarah somehow suffering due to their parents' actions. He seems okay. How
does that work for a ger?
So that's a really interesting question. It's very interesting you asked that, because I'm going to see, guys, that's why I always say it's good to give shir, because, even if you've given on the same topic before, someone will always make a new comment. That's a life. Torah is exciting. It does not, people ask me if I get bored teaching the same thing every year. I do not get bored. Okay. Not only because I teach different things, but because it's never the same thing. Okay. So there is an idea. I don't know how many of you have heard of it before. And the idea, ger shenit gayer ke katan shenolad dami. Does that ring a bell? That someone who converts, it's as if they're reborn. So obviously you could ask, when do we plug this in? How seriously do we take it? Like both halachically and hashkafically. But there does seem to be an idea that it's almost like a new beginning of the family line. Like we don't say, oh, your parents have been Irish Catholic for 17 years, so you are still part of the Irish Catholic clan. That there's a strong sense that, conversion is this radical break. It is a forging of a new identity. And since you forged a new identity, right, it's almost like you don't have the same family connections you used to have. Now, again, I realize someone could say that could be taken too far. Like don't we want the convert to still like love his non-Jewish parents, which I think we do. But maybe, wait, who raised the question? Who was it? It was Sim with you, right? So it's really interesting. Like maybe here would actually be a plus, right? You'd say that, well, even in the Ramban's world, you can't suffer for your parents' sins because, again, this kikatan shenolad, in some sense, a convert is viewed as a new family, right? So it's usually, and it's interesting, like, is this kikatan shenolad, like, as it were, almost like a legal drawback or a legal plus? So maybe it's both, actually, but I think you're saying something very interesting. Like here might be a legal plus. I like the idea a lot. Yeah, Rachel.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment, and it came to me based on Rabbi Helfgott's shir just yesterday, was what would the Ramban say about Avram Avinu? His father worshipped idols. Rivka Imenu. I mean, we don't see them suffering for that reason.
Yes, that's a good question. Look, I could just speculate, but I don't really have an answer. But one speculation is, I don't know if that Ian is so satisfying, but the fact that God could use this attribute doesn't mean he always does. Like maybe that's the best answer, actually. That in Avodah Zarah, for reasons we don't really understand at this point, somehow it's okay for the punishment to spill over, but that doesn't mean it has to happen. Maybe there's some individualized judgment each time. Is this a case where it's good to happen or not good? That I think would be the best answer.
For sure, Hashem has to have discretion. Otherwise, it's like,
right, exactly. So maybe we'll stick with that, Rachel. Maybe we'll stick with that. Maybe we'll go with divine discretion, and therefore, even Ramban doesn't mean this will invariably happen.
I'll throw in for good measure from Rabbi Helfgott's shir yesterday, the midrash that many of us learned when Avram Avinu was minding his father's idol store, and he said one idol killed the other or broke the other, and his father looked at him like he was crazy because the father clearly didn't believe the idols could do that. So maybe he wasn't actually a believer, and that's why. Whatever.
Okay. The truth is, you're raising a very interesting question, which I'll just mention for a second, and then we're going to go on. Okay, that's the problem. Rachel knows I like good tangents too much. It is interesting because the Nevi'im kind of ridicule idol worship. And on a first glance, it does seem, if I take it at a very surface level, it does seem quite silly, right? I go to the metal shop, I go to the woodworking shop, I make something, and like the second later I say it's a deity. It seems absurd. It seems childish. So the question is that really what the Ovdei Avodah Zarah were thinking, or they actually had something a bit more sophisticated than that? Like, I'm not saying they didn't actually make it or worship it, but maybe it was somehow symbolic. Like it wasn't really that, oh, this piece of wood I just fashioned yesterday made the cosmos. So, and from that perspective, the prophets might be using, I don't know, rhetoric to mock the opponent, but the opponent actually was a bit more complex than that. So I'm not getting into it, guys, but I think it's a worthy question to ask into what Rachel just said.
That's actually really satisfying to me because I've never heard it before, and the whole thing seemed very, very silly to me. But that makes more sense.
So Rachel, I'm with you, and if you want, I'll try to remember to send you more stuff about it. But it may well be that the prophets are mocking them, but they understand that people were not that idiotic. Okay, great. Okay, anybody else before we move on? We're good. Okay, great. Okay, so see your chat question, but I see you already raised it. Okay, so let's now go back to, okay, so we dealt with a contradiction. We're now going back to the question of how can we understand this philosophically? Okay, so we're going to go through 4 approaches, I think. And I just want to ask for a little patience because I think they might get more and more intriguing as we go along. Okay, so let's look at Rashi. Rashi says, what did it say in Dvarim? This might be there's both a 5th approach to the contradiction and a philosophical approach. What did it say? An ish will not die before his parents' sins. Avomish eno ish made bonaviv, haktanim meitim bavon avotam b'dei shemayim. But a minor might. Now, I realize this morally could, I think, go both ways. I think some of us then will say, that's worse, right? You're punishing this poor child who didn't do anything wrong. But I think the flip side is, what's Rashi thinking? Rashi's thinking once the child hits adulthood, they have an independent moral ledger. So at that point, you can't possibly punish a child for their parents' sins, right? Once you're a 15-year-old boy or girl, so you have your own responsibility. You have your own question of how you behave and what kind of moral person are you. But when you're 4, right, that's not true. And again, I'm not saying I'm not troubled by the idea of a 4-year-old being killed, but I think that's what Rashi's thinking, that the 4-year-old is somehow carried along with a parent because they're really not an independent moral player. So again, I'm just going to put 2 things out there, and then I'll take your comment, Alana. Rashi would give us perhaps a 5th answer to the contradiction. Adult children are not punished for their parents' sins, but a minor child can. And in terms of the moral question, Rashi would say, look, when you're an adult, we judge you. You're making moral choices. But we all understand that a 5-year-old is not like that. So a 5-year-old is somehow carried away with the parental judgment. Yeah, Lana.
Yeah, I was just wondering if he's just commenting on the very basic, nature versus nurture. Like when you have a child, this is all they know. So therefore, this is really a punishment for, it's removing any agency from a child, but it's basically a punishment for the parent by having their minor children die.
Yes, you could say it that way. You could say it that way. Yeah, Bert.
Yeah, but we also have the concept of Tinuk Shenishba, so that therefore, why in fact should he be punished for that?
Hey, look, you are right. I'm not saying this fully justifies the punishment, but in a certain sense, you might end up with something that's, I don't know if it's paradoxical, but that the child can only be punished for their parents' sins and can't be punished for their own sins. Meaning, I think Alana used a good phrase before. Again, and Berta, I'm not going to champion Rashi as my favorite approach, but I like to be as honest as possible and get the major approaches out there. I think Alana used a good phrase before, that the child doesn't have independent moral agency. So precisely for that reason, right, a child can't be punished. Like if you take a child to Beit Din and say, this child was Mechalel Shabbat, it doesn't even get off the ground, right? The case doesn't start. Beit Din will not prosecute a child for Chilul Shabbat. Beit Din will not prosecute a child for theft. And even some of you may know, there are even sources that it's not just till 13. Some of you have heard sources that maybe you can't be punished by God till you're 20, right? But that is all because you don't yet have mature, independent moral agency. And I'm totally on board. I think what Rashi's saying is that here the child is not being punished as an independent moral agent. The child is somehow being subsumed under the parent. Now, again, Bert, I admit someone could object to that too. But I still think that's why it's not exactly the same as your case, that we're consistently affirming that a child is not an independent moral player and therefore can't be responsible for what they did. And even this Rashi, which again is not my favorite approach, is not saying they're responsible for what they did. Yeah, Eitan Senger.
No, but I understand. But if you believe that the educational, the approach that the person was taught, was taught avodah zarah. So so he's not an independent moral, person. So what? God could differentiate. You punish the person that taught him the wrong way.
Okay, but again, Bert, I'm totally sympathetic to your point, but let me break up the question into 2. I could say, how could you punish this kid for worshiping avodah zarah? I could say, how could you punish this kid for his father and mother worshiping avodah zarah? I agree, they're both legitimate questions. But if I asked Rashi, I think what would Rashi say? I am never doing the former. I am never punishing the kid for his worshiping avodah zarah. Meaning, even in this case, I'm not punishing the kid for his worshiping avodah zarah. I am punishing the parent. Now, Bert, I'm free. I totally agree. You could still have the second objection. But I'm just pointing out, Rashi is saying the first category does not exist. Okay, we are not punishing the kid for his own actions. Okay, and again, we could then debate, is the second category any better? But we are never punishing him for his own actions as a child. Okay, Eitan.
This may be a separate conversation, but what about the reverse of that, where, let's say, a child getting extra reward for a good deed of their parent or whatever, meaning, let's say they're below bar bat mitzvah, so therefore the individual deed that they're doing is not an actual chiyuv mitzvah yet their parents are doing something else. What's sort of the conversation there? Well,
don't forget, I mentioned this very briefly, Eitan. The second source in Shemot not only said poked avon avot, but remember it also said notzer chesed la'alafim, that God, as it were, notzer is like to guard something, to keep something. Right? So like nitzor l'shoni meira. So God, as it were, guards that chesed for 2,000 generations. So it sounds like the spillover from reward for good is way beyond the spillover for wrongdoing, right? So again, how it plays out, we could debate, but it sounds like there's more largesse there, that there's more collective bounty than there would be collective punishment. Okay? Eitan, you good?
Yeah, but, what about, let's say, a kid who, let's say, does a good deed? Can the parent then get the reward?
Okay, you're saying because if I'm really claiming he's not an independent moral agent, is that your question?
Right, yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. I'm going to duck it for now. Okay, now I have three more approaches I wanted to sneak in, but I think in the interest of time, to make sure I finish on time, I'm going to do two, and we'll see if we have time for the third. So let's go a little bit further down, and we're about to, things are getting really exciting now, because we're going to go the mystics versus the rationalists. Okay, we will see who everybody is sympathetic to here. Okay, and the mystics and the rationalists are going to go in a completely different way. Okay, so we saw before the Ramban alluded to a Kabbalistic secret, but did not elucidate it, which is his general approach. And I mentioned that Rabbeinu Bechaye does. So if we look at source 12, he says, Al derech ha-Kabbalah, what would the Kabbalists say? Pokei avon avon al banim, zeu sod ha-ibur. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, although we have a pretty knowledgeable audience here, but Sod HaIbur is a code word for reincarnation. Okay, so the Ramban and the Kabbalists, they believe in Gilgal. I will just point out that, many of the rationalists did not believe in Gilgal. So any of you who do not want to believe in reincarnation, you don't have to think that every Jew believes in it. Many rabbis did not believe in it, but the Kabbalists did. And now, what are the Kabbalists going to do? It's pretty remarkable. In what sense does God visit the parents' sins on the children? Guess what? When the children are not their biological children, I know what word to use. They're their reincarnatory children, right? Meaning you get punished in your next identity because you're a continuation of the previous identity. And I just want to point out two things, right? Whether you like Kabbalist's idea or not, or into reincarnation or not, it is a way of insisting on individual responsibility at the end of the day, right? That those who do not like this idea, this should make Bert happy. Maybe Bert's going to become a Kabbalist now, right? That we do not have an idea that innocent children suffer for their parents' sins, but rather that, the Gilgal of the second identity, which is, as it were, the child of the first identity, is the one that suffers. Just one brief thing. Remember the Ramban alluded to a pasuk in Kohelet when he did a hint? And once I highlight the pasuk, you'll all see why he alluded to it. Which pasuk did he alluded to, even though he didn't quote it? Ramban was very reticent. Dor holech v'dor ba. What does Kohelet say? One generation goes and the other generation comes. Now, I admit that's not a proof for reincarnation, because you could say it's two different people, two different identities. But how do the Kabbalists want to read it? It's the same door. One generation goes, and then their souls come back to fix things in a subsequent generation. So again, those who do not like the idea of any kind of collective punishment, so this would be a Kabbalistic way out of it. Okay, now we're now going to move to a more philosophic, rationalistic way out of it. But is everyone okay? I want to comment on the Kabbalistic way? Okay, or we can move on to, maybe we'll hold off for the last 5 minutes for comments. Let's go to the rationalistic way. Now, when I say medieval rationalism, probably most of you think of Rambam. Okay, Frank, you just wait 3 minutes. Is that okay, Frank?
Yeah.
Most of you, actually, 5 minutes, friend. I'll take the last 5 minutes will just be comments.
Okay.
But I just want to point out that Ralbag, Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, Gersonides, was even more radical rationalist than the Rambam. And he says something, I think, that is really sharp. Whether he's right about the pasuk, he is certainly right about life. By the way, just one interesting tangent about him. He also is into astronomy. There's actually a crater on the moon named for him. Okay, so I'm not going to do it because I'm running out of time, but if anyone wants to look it up, there are 3 rabbis in Jewish history with craters on the moon named for them. That is great trivia. Who could name the 3 rabbis with craters on the moon named for them? You now know that the Ralbag Gersonides is one of the 3. Okay, here we go. The Ralbag katab she'inyan pokei avon al banim hu she'anshu habanim ba'onesh aviyem. The children are punished. But wait, aval zehu b'mikreh. But this is by accident, by happenstance. What does he mean? Kishiavor tov ma me'ha'avot, when you take away a good from the parents, yikreh lebneihem achreihem, shelo bi'adam hatov. The children do not have that good. I think there's a tremendous point in terms of philosophy and logical analysis. We could debate if it's pshat in the pasuk. Now, Rachel said before that we all have collective punishment on some level. And she pointed out, like when we sanction a country. But I'd like to make a different point where we all have collective punishment. Unfortunately, in life, even those of us most committed to individual responsibility, you can't escape collective punishment. Because anytime you punish a father, it naturally has a spillover effect on the children. Not because God creates a spillover effect. By definition, it does, right? Just think about it. If we let's say dad is put in prison for 20 years, the children are not going to suffer because their dad was in prison for 20 years. Of course, that has an effect on them. Let us say mom has been involved in a financial scandal and has to pay a tremendous amount of money of restitution. And then the family goes from wealth to poverty. So then the children are affected. They grew up in wealth and they move to poverty. Of course, they're adversely affected. So unless we never punish anybody, like punishments are almost by definition spill over. So the Ralbag says it's not that God is choosing to punish the children. It is the natural impact of a punishment. And notice what works out nicely for Ralbag. What did the pasuk say? 3 or 4 generations. What will Ralbag say? Well, in the natural order, it doesn't go on forever. Like after it's 5 generations later, right, the family's had time to turn things around. They might not be feeling the effect anymore. They've gotten beyond the trauma, but not in the first couple of generations. So notice, I think there's this fascinating duality here that both the Kabbalists and the rationalists in totally different ways have kind of neutralized the idea of collective punishment, where the Kabbalists are saying, no, it is the latest Gilgal, the latest iteration of your identity being punished. And the rationalists, like the Ralbag, will say that, no, it is a natural impact and not God. Now, I just want to show you one more thing, and then I'll do a little summary. Actually, maybe I'll take questions before the little summary. Okay, Fran, I'm getting to 1 minute. We're almost there. Okay, so now if one wanted to critique Ralbag, one might say that's really interesting, and I think he's certainly right about life, but is he right about the pasuk? When the pasuk says "Poked avon avot," does it sound like that's just the natural order of things taking effect? Or does that sound like it's attributing a more active role to God? Someone who tells me it sounds like it's attributing a more active role to God, might not think that that's a good reading. So I want to do one more thing just to show you the beauties of Torah and life. So there's an Italian commentary from the 1800s known as Shadal, Shmuel David Luzzatto. I think he's really not read enough. He's really a beautiful, beautiful commentary. But as I said before, guys, one of the great things about Torah is that you rethink things. So look at this Shadal. I'm really just quoting and get to show you how the great commentaries also restore things in life. Okay, here we go. I just asked my daughter, Tila, I have 6 minutes left, so you just try to be quiet for 6 more minutes. Okay, my daughter is baking in the kitchen, I think, so there's no banging the pots, if that's okay. Okay, thanks. Okay, here we go. So give me 1 more second, guys. I have 1 more minute. So he quotes the Ralbag on the first line. Look at the second line. Vani bishnat taf kuf tzadi dalid hiksheti alav. So if you want to place this in Jewish history, so in the year of 1834, and 1834, I thought the Ralbag is not the pshat, because the pasuk is giving God a more active role. But look what happened. We skipped down a little bit. Ulam ata bishnat tafrish en hey. But then when we got to 1805, 11 years later, I reread the pasuk and I thought it works, right? That sometimes God's actions are indirect and the pasuk will still talk about it in a direct way. So at that point, the pasuk could describe the natural order, even with God's activity, as it were. Okay, so I'm now going to take comments, and in the last 2 minutes, I'll summarize. Fran, what do you want to say?
I don't think I understand the Kabbalist approach.
Okay,
Are
sure.
you saying that the child will suffer when he comes back as another
Okay,
child?
so again, no, it's that the child doesn't mean the child. The child means the next identity of the father. That's what Ben means. That
So
when
that
the
means
father
that
comes back in transmigration of souls, that he is, as it were, the son of the previous identity,
So
and he
something,
now suffers for his sins in his previous identity.
so that would cause anybody to, when something bad happens, to say, what did I do in another identity?
Ah, that is such a great question okay. I hope it's not, I always wonder if it's like bad form to quote your own articles. I always wonder that or not, but I'm going to do it anyway. Okay. So I'm just going to, here, let's see. So I wrote an article. Actually, you know what? I don't have to post it. I'll just mention it. I wrote an article in the Torah Umara Journal, I think volume 10. But if you want to look it up, it is called Body and Soul. So just look up Yitzchak Blau, Body and Soul. It discusses reincarnation, the arguments for and against. And friend, the psychological issue you're raising is raised there. It's a very, very interesting question. Sometimes we can evaluate a religious doctrine, not just from an abstract philosophic perspective, but from a psychological perspective. Like, will this lead to better performance or worse? Is it healthy to think that a reward and punishment I'm receiving is not about what I've done here, but what I've done elsewhere? Is that a healthy thing to think or an unhealthy thing to think? So, friend, that is a great question, and I do address it briefly in that article.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and if you want, you could, maybe I'll just write my email in case anybody wants to email me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, here, let's do this. I'll do my easy email. So it's yitzchakblau2@gmail.com. If anyone has any follow-up questions or just want to schmooze about anything, I am happy to answer. Okay, so let me just do a brief summary here. We raised two questions about whether Chumash is consistent about children suffering for their parents' sins, and how can I philosophically understand why they should. In terms of the consistency now, maybe we have already 5 different answers. You guys did a very good job helping out with that. That number one, maybe things change over the course of biblical history. Okay, number 2, in the Ramban, maybe there's a difference between Avodah Zarah and other sins. In Rashi, maybe it depends whether the children are adults or minors. Then we had Sima and the Rashbam. Maybe it depends whether it's Beitin or God, that Beitin can't do that and God can. And I'm missing the 5th. What was the 5th? Maybe I do it. Rachel, right? Rachel suggested that maybe death is different than other punishments. Maybe we stop short of death when we get to collective responsibility. Okay, but in my mind, the more important question is how can we understand this? Why is it justified? So we now have the following. If you're the Ramban, you're really saying it's very limited. Now, someone could still complain. Someone could be sympathetic with Bert and say, I don't care if it's limited to Avodah Zarah, I'm still unhappy. But the Ramban seems to think once I've limited to Avodah Zarah, it's okay. We have Rashi thinking it's okay if I limit it to minors. Now, I agree. In some ways, people think minors make it worse. But again, I'll go with Alana's phrase that the minors are not considered independent moral agents yet. And therefore, their judgment might just be, as it were, swallowed by the parents. Although, again, one could object. And then we ended with this very interesting duality, how often in life, the mystics and the rationalists are kind of at loggerheads with each other. And here they're both in different ways sympathetic to each other because they both want to say that those who don't like collective punishment, here's your man, right? Here's your people, right? The Kabbalists say, no, children aren't being punished. Your next reincarnated identity, that's the Ben who's being punished. So that would be a way to maintain individual responsibility. And the Ralbag says it's all happening naturally. God is not punishing the children. Unfortunately, it's just the way of the world. If you punish a parent with jail, with capital punishment, with anything, there's a spillover effect negatively for the child. And Shadal at first did not like that, but he came to like it. So maybe I'll close with this. Okay, and I think Menachem Litek might be up next. I see he's on the chat here, so that would be great for all of you. But I'll just say that we have different sources in our tradition. And different people, we don't need a psak here. So different people could identify with different positions. But those of you who, like me, maybe, and like Bert, don't like the idea of collective punishment, I think we do have a certain comfort here that in the Middle Ages, both the Kabbalists and the rationalists, both Ramban and Ralbag in different ways, really ended up affirming that individual punishment is the operative term. Now, again, I don't want to infringe on the next speaker. So maybe just very briefly, who are the 2 people who have hands raised?
Yeah, I just want to understand one thing. Are we presuming though that if a child knows that his father was Mechalel Shabbos and he takes on all the halachot of Shabbat and he's a frum Jew, should he not feel that should he be worried? Well, I'm going to get punished anyway, so what's the point?
Well, don't forget, if we really take stock of all the commentaries we saw, the overall majority of positions would say he's not going to be punished.
Okay.
Right? The Kabbalists would say he's not. The Rationalists would say he's not. By the way, even Ramban would say he's not. Because what would Ramban say? This is not.
Right. Just
idolatry.
about as are. Right.
Right. So I do think the weight of what we saw is that child should not be worried.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.
All right, guys. It was really a pleasure. Please feel free to email me and enjoy the rest of the day.